Okay, so we're going to talk about long-term liabilities today. I think I've told you guys before, I get pretty confused teaching intermediate and you guys at the same time because you guys, like week in and week out, are kind of like back and forth as to where I am in the material because intermediate basically covers the same stuff, just a little bit deeper. So, if I remember right, we talked about current liabilities last time. Is that right? So long-term liabilities would be basically anything that you owe to anyone else that is longer than the 1-year limit that we put on short-term liabilities. So when we talk about long-term liabilities for a corporation, most commonly, or the most common way that you'll see those for a business is through bonds. Okay, so at this point in your accounting life, I hope you understand what a bond is. But basically, a bond is a way for a corporation to generate capital. If they need money to operate, grow, whatever it is that they need money for that they don't have, they have choices as to how they get that money. One of the choices is to borrow it. Okay, so if a corporation issues a bond to someone, that's them saying basically, issuing a bond is like giving an IOU to someone, okay? Because the bond states an interest rate, a term, so an amount of time that you're going to have to pay this interest, and also whatever the face value of the bond is, that's the amount that the corporation is going to eventually pay back to whoever bought these bonds at the outset. So from the perspective of the person or the entity buying the bonds, the purpose of bonds is to earn interest, basically. So you buy a bond, you know what the interest rate's going to be, you collect interest payments. So, a lot of entities will use bonds as a way to kind of hedge risk because really the only way a bond doesn't pay off is if the company goes out of business that issued the bond. And at that point, if you remember when we talked about the basic accounting equation, creditors get paid first. Yeah, surprised at how full it is, huh?
Sorry for late.
No, you're good. You showed up, so I mean, you're already doing better than half the class.
Trust me, I contemplated not, but I figured I would.
I will not comment on where I would have fallen if I was a student today. Okay, so from the perspective of the purchaser of the bond, it's about the interest rate. Obviously, getting paid back the principal that you paid down, that's important to you, but obviously that's just your money coming back. So that's not going to motivate you necessarily to purchase the bond. So generally it's the interest rate, and the interest rate could be, so if I'm a corporation, I sell 10% bonds, and the market right now is at 12%, I would also then have to incentivize you to buy my bonds because you wouldn't want to earn 10% when you could earn 12% elsewhere. So you have what's on the face of the bond, the interest rate, and then if that's different than what's in the marketplace, then the company selling the bonds will say, okay, loan us or pay us $900,000 now for this $1 million bond in 10 years. It pays you the interest as if you had loaned us $1 million and also pays you back $1 million at the end of the time. So that's an extra $100,000 that is essentially an interest payment, but it's discounted right up front in order to kind of match the market rate of interest that's out there. And it goes both ways. So if the bonds you're selling are 10%, but the market's paying 8%, then you can sell that for a premium, and people will actually pay you more than what they're going to get paid back in principal in the end, just because the rate of interest as they go is higher than what they could get elsewhere in the marketplace. So theoretically, if the marketplace is efficient, all of the different prices for bonds are going to equal out. Now, whether you get that money equally over the term of the bond, or whether part of it's discounted or marked up right at the outset, that's going to depend, and maybe that might influence your choice of investment, but that's how you take care of that. And I sometimes get questions from students, well, if a corporation is selling a bond and it's an instrument that they created, why don't they just change the interest rate on it before they sell it if the market rate's different? And the easiest way to answer that is just that the issuance of bonds is not something that you snap your fingers and it happens. So it takes some time for the approval process, for the legal process to play itself out in the issuing of these bonds, and you don't want to redo it. If you're paying a bond attorney $800 an hour to help you, or several of these attorneys, or a whole team, depending on the size of your company, to set up these bonds, and all of a sudden the market rate changes, well, you're not going to want to double your legal fees just to change what the piece of paper says on it. So you just go to the marketplace with what you got, and you mark it up or you mark it down, depending on what's in the marketplace. From the perspective of the corporation that's generating capital, these are the advantages and disadvantages of using bonds. And typically the choice is between either using bonds or stock. Remember, stock is you're basically selling part of the company, ownership in the company, in exchange for cash that you can use to grow right now. Or you can borrow the money through bonds, know that you're going to have to pay it back eventually, plus interest, but you are not giving up or diluting the control of the company by creating more and more owners or by pushing more stock out there. Okay. Also, you are paying interest when you borrow money, but that interest is tax deductible. Let's see. This is obviously just the opposite of that. So it's basically just saying bonds can, since they're longer term instruments and they're based on an interest rate, if the interest rate fluctuates wildly during the term of the bond, both the entity selling the bond and the person or the entity buying the bond, they're both subject to interest rate risk, where maybe the interest rate goes really high or goes really low, and if you would have just waited as an investor another year to invest in bonds, maybe you're getting paid twice as much interest. But because you bought when you did, when the market was the way it was, your return on your equity is much lower. Okay, so it can go both ways depending on interest rate risk, and also this refers also to the overall equity in the company, depending on how damaging or I shouldn't say damaging per se, but how difficult of circumstances having this liability on your accounts creates. Depending on that can also greatly change the year-to-year net income and how that flows into the stockholders' equity. Basically, what it boils down to, typically when companies make this decision on whether to sell bonds or to issue stock, do I want to give up more control of the company or do I not? Okay, that's the stock side. And then the bond side is cash flow going to be sufficient to okay, I got this influx of cash right up front, but over the term of the bond, is the cash flow that I'm anticipating, is that going to be sufficient both to pay off this debt and then also to do whatever I need to do to grow the company? And then depending on what your answers as a corporation are to those questions, that would determine which way you went as far as how you want to get your capital. I'm not real interested in you guys being able to read a tracking sheet for bonds, anything like that, as long as you know the basic principles behind it. So this is what, I don't know if anyone owns bonds in here, but This is what a note might typically look like. It will have the interest rate, the principal, and then a bunch of fine print terms on it. Again, typically these days, or at least sometimes these days, you don't even get a paper one. Everything's electronic, but same information. So how do we account for that? Okay, so again, from the corporation's perspective, when we issue the bonds, assuming in this case we sold it for the par value, we record the amount of cash that we got. They loaned us this money essentially, and now eventually we're going to have to pay it back. Okay, so basically what's sitting in this payable account, that's what's building and earning interest, or not earning interest for us, but for the entity that purchased these bonds. Okay, and then those interest payment dates occur on the 30th of June and the 31st of December. And then 20 years later, you've got the maturity date. Okay, so these are obviously dates of interest because we're going to need to pay interest on the semi-annual dates, and then obviously whenever we get to the maturity date, we're going to have to pay back what we borrowed. Okay, so figuring interest, again, we've talked about this before. The biggest mistake I see from most people is not remembering that an interest rate typically, unless stated otherwise, is an annual rate. So if you're having to calculate 2 payments during the year, you have to cut that in half. So the easiest way I think to do it is to multiply whatever the principal is, the $800,000, times the annual rate, and that gives you what you're paying for the year, and then divide that by however many interest payments you have to make that year. So if it's a semi-annual payment, you're making 2 payments during the year. Once you figured out what the annual payment's going to be, in this case it would have been $72,000, divide that in half, and as of June 30th, we would record the cash going out to pay for that interest expense, and the expense would be recorded as well. And then that would occur every 6 months for that entire 20-year period. Then once the bonds are ready to be paid off completely, we've paid all the interest, all that's left is we have to pay back the principal, which is sitting as a liability right now, credit balance in our balance sheet. So we want to debit that to get rid of it. That would now be 0, and we would credit cash for the amount that we paid. Again, just like any other liability. This is what we talked about when, yes, sir.
So the interest they gain, you just get paid that throughout the years, and then when the bond expires, you just get face value?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're talking from the perspective of the purchaser of the bond.
Yes.
Yes. So from the date you purchased the bond, you give me $800,000. Thank you. Okay. Now, every 6 months I pay you the interest, and then at the end of the period, I pay you the $800,000 back. Now, if the interest rate had changed, and I'm paying 10%, but the market's paying 15%, then you don't want my bonds anymore. So instead of giving me $800,000, I say, well, give me $700,000 today. I'll still pay you the interest as if you had paid me $800,000 every 6 months for 20 years, and then in 20 years I'll also give you $800,000 instead of the $700,000. Okay, so I give you $100,000 more in 20 years, which you basically, as an investor, would then essentially divide up over the entire 20-year period and say, okay, 1/40th of this amount is going into each one of these interest payments, because essentially that's what it is. We've changed the interest rate by changing the amount of principal you're going to get back at the end. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So, whenever the amount on the bond is different from the market rate, then we have to change the amount that we're going to pay back at the end. It's either going to be more than the company gave us if if we have to incentivize them to buy our bonds, or it's going to be less than the company gave us if our bonds are so good that the interest rate is so high that they're willing to pay more than they're going to get back in the end because they want that extra interest rate bump.
Do they all have some kind of expiration date? Are there any that are just like hidden away in some trunk from the 20s?
Oh, bonds? No. I mean, they're all because I mean, think about it. If you are the company selling the bonds, how long do you want to pay interest for?
Yeah, okay.
Right? So yeah, they're all gonna. I mean, typically bonds are 20-year. Almost. I mean, I would say 95% of the bonds you see on the marketplace are 20-year bonds. Why that is, I don't know. They issue 10-year bonds sometimes. In the municipal market, I've seen them go down to like 5 years. Again, it kind of, basically you're not limited at all. You could do whatever you wanted. You could say this is for 500 years, but obviously that would be a long time to risk interest rate fluctuations and everything else. Okay. Okay. So, look at an example of discount here. Okay. So, bond on its face says it will pay 8%, but the market's paying 10%. So, as a corporation, if we want to sell these 8% bonds, we have to figure out basically, and I'm not going to get into how this is figured out all that much because I don't want you guys to worry about that. But basically, we're figuring out what the difference in cash flow is over the term between 8% and 10%. We're discounting that back to the present day, and that's the difference that we're going to pay between what's on the face of the bond and what they're actually going to give you for it. Okay, so in this case, we figured out that if they pay or if they loan us 96.454% of this $100,000 bond, so in other words, if they loan us $96,454 today, we pay the 8% every 6 months on this $100,000. So basically that would be, what, $4,000 every 6 months for 20 years, I think. Or no, let's see. Oh, this is only a 2-year bond. So we do this for 2 years, and we say, okay, the difference between those two, discounted back to the present date, means that if they pay us this $96,454 today, we pay them the interest and then repay them $100,000 in 2 years, they would be equally benefited as they would if they went into the marketplace and bought 10% bonds instead of our 8% bonds. Or at least that's the theory, right? Since this is basically a guess at what the market will do over the course of the next 2 years, you're still subject, no matter which side you're on, whether you're issuing the bonds or buying the bonds, to interest rate risk. If the interest rate goes up or down, you would obviously have gotten better or worse deal had you waited to buy the bonds then or to sell them at a later date. Okay, so once we figured out the numbers here, how much we needed to discount to get to the exact right number that would make it an equal investment, then we obviously need to record it in our books. So the way that we do that, obviously we want to show how much money they gave us. Okay, so anytime we're getting money, debit cash for that amount. Okay, and we know bonds payable, the amount we're going to have to pay back in 2 years is what's on the face of the bond, and that's $100,000, and it's a credit because it's a liability. So we know that the difference between these two is this amount, and then it needs to go on the debit side so that the debit side equals the credit side. Okay? So basically what we have here, we have something that's going to sit on our balance sheet, and we're basically going to remove a little piece of this discount with every interest payment that we make. Okay, and we're gonna say we're gonna treat it on our books as if we're paying that little percentage extra in interest each time. So over the course of this bond, in this case, there's only going to be 4 interest payments. So 1/4 of this amount will disappear from discount on bonds payable account each interest payment, and by the end of the term of the bond, this discount amount will be 0 because we will have essentially pulled out whatever discount we gave them and applied it to the interest payments. So you'll see how that works in a second here, as far as what the journal entry looks like. This is just what it looks like on the balance sheet. You see less discount on bonds payable. That's where that amount gets carried, so that at any point in time, if you subtract what we owe in the end minus this discount, you get the carrying value. Okay? That basically means if you then went out in the marketplace, if the person who bought the bonds went out in the marketplace the next day, that's essentially how much they'd be able to get for these bonds. Okay? Okay, let's see. All right, here's the journal entry for when we make these interest payments. Okay, so the actual, on our books, the bond interest expense includes both the cash that we actually paid out, which we figure by just multiplying the interest rate on the bond times the principal amount on the bond, and then divide that by the number of interest payments per year. That's the 4,000. This is that 1/4 piece of that discount. So by crediting that, we are lowering the amount that sits in that discount account. And we, for the purposes of our books, don't differentiate between actual cash paid out in interest and this discount amount. Okay? And the reason that we don't is because basically we've already captured the difference between that in that discount that we granted at the beginning of this term, and now we're basically just using the books to kind of invent a way for this to work with the matching principle better. Okay, but that's how you do it there. So in terms of actually figuring out what amount to put in this format, you're basically going to look at what was the original amount in the discount account and divide that amount by the total number of interest payments you're going to have to make on these bonds. Whatever that amount is will be the discount that is deducted with each interest payment. Okay, so that just shows that as time goes by, once we get to the maturity of this bond, the discount is down to 0. Because basically, all that's essentially saying is the day before this bond pays off $100,000, what's it worth? $100,000. Because, you know, if I give you $100,000 tonight and you give me $100,000 in the morning, you know, there's not a lot of time for interest to accumulate there, right? So that makes sense that as of the second when you're about to give over this $100,000, that value of that bond should equal the $100,000. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through the premium side because it functions the exact same way, just on the opposite side. Okay, so everything that used to be called a discount is now called a premium, and if it used to be a debit, it's now a credit, and that's essentially the only difference between these two. Okay, so interest rate in the marketplace is lower than what we're paying on our bonds, so we can charge more for them. So what that means is you give me $103,546 today, I pay you the interest on that over the term of the bond, and then I pay you back less than you paid me because this $3,546 is now extra money you had to pay in order to get a better interest rate. And then I go through the same way. You calculate the carrying value the same way, except now instead of minus discount on bonds payable, it's plus premium on bonds payable, and you add the two instead of netting them together. And then as you go paying these, you are excuse me, you are paying this interest rate, but you're basically only recognizing a certain percentage of each of these interest payments as an expense because you had all of this extra money they gave you up front as a way to kind of artificially lower the interest rate. So, like I said, functions the exact same way, just flip premium, discount, and debit and credit. And of course, as you're going down and reducing the amount that's in this account, the only difference is whether you're reducing something that's on the debit side or reducing something that's on the credit side. At the end of the day, still, the second before I pay over this $100,000, how much is the bond worth? Well, it's worth $100,000, right? That should make sense. Anytime before that last second, if interest is still being paid and that interest is still more than what's in the marketplace, then someone would still be interested in paying more than what's the face value on the bond is in order to get that extra interest. Again, this is all assuming that we have all of the assumptions that people make when they say that the markets will take care of themselves. You assume that they're rational investors, that their goal is to maximize profits, all of this stuff. If all those things hold true, then really there should be no difference in someone's mind between a discounted and a premium bond, because in the end, it should all reflect what the marketplace is giving you. Okay, then we also have bond retirement. Obviously, that's when you are paying off what you owe in principal. And as of that moment, right before you're paying it off, you've already eliminated any discount or premium. So all that's left is what you initially put in the bonds payable account, which would be the face value of the bonds. If you retire bonds before they're fully matured, we haven't really talked about this a lot, but sometimes that's a provision on the bond note itself. It says, hey, if we don't want to pay you interest for 20 years and we have the cash to do it, at any point during this period, we can pay you back your principal and say we're done. Okay? Now, obviously, that changes the dynamic of the investment. So if that makes investors perceive it as more risky, then they have to be compensated for that. And all of that may affect the amount that you can get for the bonds. Okay?
Yeah. That sounds like
a terrible deal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they can just so I spend $100,000 thinking this is gonna
pay all this interest.
Build up for 20 years, and they can just say no, we're done at any time.
Yeah.
Is that just any bond? Or
well, I mean, it's in the provisions, right? So the bond itself, that little fine print that you saw in the note, is a contract between the bondholder and the issuer. If the terms of that contract say, hey, we have the right to recall or to retire early these bonds, then that's part of your contract.
Why would anybody do that?
So, like I said, if you as an investor are comparing that to something that doesn't have that, you'd be like, well, I'm going to take the one that doesn't have that risk, right?
Absolutely.
So you would have to be compensated for that, right? to make those equal in your mind, there would have to be something on that recallable one that made you say, well, I think I like that one a little better. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll say, okay, we have the right to recall this bond, but we'll pay you half of the remaining interest that we owe you, that we would owe you. So in your mind, you say, well, that kind of sucks because I don't get the whole 20 years worth, but I get, let's say there's 10 years left. I get 5 years of that today instead of having to wait 5 years on those interest payments, and I get all the money I got that I paid into it back. And then that's not always the term. There may be other things on there. They may say, hey, if we recall these early, we'll compensate you in stock, or whatever the case may be. I mean, these instruments can literally be as creative as you want them to be, assuming that you're meeting the SEC guidelines. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. If it seems like it sucks in your mind, then that's, a savvy investor is going to think the same thing, and they're going to say, hell no, I'm not going to buy that unless you give me something else. And whatever that is whatever that is. And
is the interest exponential at any time, or is it always just like a flat rate each year? Then I guess it would make sense, but if the interest becomes exponential, and then at the 5th year you're gaining.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah, okay.
Because the way a bond works is you're not building interest on interest, which is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right? With
It's
some
never
investments,
exponential for
it's
any
not
of
like you're taking the interest money, putting it back in the bank, and having that earn interest again and
Sure.
again and again,
Okay.
because you have this stated principal amount, and that's what the interest rate is getting figured by, and that never changes. If the interest payments were increasing the principal, then that would create your exponential growth pattern. But yeah, I mean, the marketplace is what it is. If someone could pay a bond attorney a bunch of money to write out and to draft these bonds and get it all ready and have this provision in there where they can recall the bonds, and the marketplace says, we're not going to do that. And all of a sudden, well, they have two choices. At that point, they can either start discounting the bonds more and more, or say, pay us less and less now, we'll pay you more and more in the future. That's one good way to do it, because let's say you give me $90,000 now, I give you $100,000 in 20 years, plus whatever the interest rate is over time. If tomorrow I come back and say I want to recall these bonds early, and I've not paid you any interest yet, well, I still have to give you the $100,000 extra. Is that what I said it was? $1,900,000, whatever it was. I have to pay you the difference, that premium, tomorrow, instead of you waiting 20 years for it. So yeah, from your perspective, that might be a pretty good deal, because you don't have to figure out, well, how much do I make over this 20-year period? You're accelerating the entire amount that you're going to make off this to one day. That's a lot more, right? So as long as there are provisions in there that excite investors, and typically you know what's out there. I mean, before you even draft the bonds, you probably even know more or less who's going to buy them. The market is not a big secret. That's the good thing about it, is it's publicly known. You can go out there, you can see what's there, and then as long as you have a remotely competent attorney, you're going to be able to draft something that interests and excites investors. And then worst case scenario, if they suck and the bonds don't sell, then you just keep discounting them until they do, if you need to, if that makes more sense than redrafting the whole thing. Okay, so here's where I talked about, here maybe one of the provisions may be, hey, instead of bonds, let's say we want to retire them early, so we'll just flip them and turn it into common stock. Again, this would be totally dependent on the provisions in the bond contract itself, and we're saying that according to those provisions, we have the right to convert any bonds that are outstanding at any point in time to shares of stock based on this ratio. Okay, so if we do, in this case, let's see here. Okay, yeah. So we look at, again, if you remember back to when we did talk about stock in here, right? About paid-in capital in excess of par. Okay, just want to make sure that was not my intermediate class. Same as any sale of stock or any issuance of stock. Under the common stock section, we would record whatever the shares times the par value. And then in this case, we're changing a liability to owner's capital, basically. Okay? So this debit to bonds payable reflects the entire principal of the bond that we were going to have to pay. Instead of giving these people cash, the terms of the bond state that we are going to give them this stock. So we debit the bonds payable to get rid of it, and then the credit side of this looks just like it would if we went out and sold this in the marketplace. The difference is, instead of looking at the cash we got for these stocks and using that to determine how much paid-in capital in excess of par we're going to look at, we treat the market value of these shares as whatever the liability is that we're canceling. So in this case, we're canceling $100,000 of liability. Well, that to us means that we're giving $100,000 worth of stock to these people in exchange. Okay? So the par value is $30,000. The difference between the par value and the value of the stock we're giving away is paid-in capital in excess of par. Everybody understand how that works? Again, you're basically just going to be looking at whatever it is that the bond contract says you can do, and if that's what it is, then whenever you're retiring the bonds, you debit out the total in the bonds payable account, and if it's stock, that's what the credit side looks like. Okay, so now we're switching to, instead of bonds, we're talking about notes payable. Okay, so note payable is still liability. Basically, this slide is just saying, well, when is a note payable a long-term liability versus a short-term liability? And that's going to depend on when you have to pay back the principal. If that's longer than a year away, then the note payable would be considered a long-term liability. So that's just this here. These two slides are just highlighting the difference between, there are some notes payable that don't pay any interest until you pay off the principal. Okay, so you borrow money, you pay nothing until you have to pay back the money. At that time, you pay principal plus interest. Or you have, you borrow money, like for instance, you buy a car, costs $30,000. You calculate out the interest, and each month you make a payment that consists of part principal, where you're paying down the car, part interest, where you're paying interest to the note holder. So that's illustrated by what that looks like. The reason we distinguish between these two is when we're talking about long-term versus short-term, in this scenario, part of this liability would be long-term and part would be short-term, because let's say that, you make 4 payments a year. So these first 4 payments are all coming in the first year, so that would be a short-term liability. And then the rest of these would be coming post 1 year, so that would be a long-term liability. Just like any liability, whenever you get the initial payment where someone's either paying you or you bought goods or whatever, you record the amount you got. If it's cash, if it's another asset like goods, you would record that amount in an asset account. And whatever the principal is you have to pay back at the end of this term goes down in whatever payable account you're using. Remember, as of the first day of this contract, there is no interest due. interest accumulates over time. So as of the first day, we only owe the principal back. Then as time passes, we owe not only the principal, but also the interest payments. So this is what that schedule would look like. And this is, again, the example of something similar to a car loan, where you're paying off, you're paying monthly payments, and each payment consists of part interest and part principal. Okay? So, how does that work? Basically, you're coming up with an amount of cash that you're going to pay out each payment date. So in this case, it's once a year. At the end of each year, you're going to pay the same amount of cash, $12,979. As of the first payment, 8% times whatever is the balance of the principal is how much of this total payment is going towards interest. Then whatever's left between the total payment amount and subtracting out the interest expense, that's how much you've paid down the principal for that payment. So you see, as time passes, there's less of a balance that you owe, which means when you calculate interest on that balance, the amount of interest that you pay each period goes down. Which means that if the payment stays the same each time, but the amount of that payment that's going towards interest is lower, that means that the amount that you're reducing the principal with each payment is going higher and higher until you get to the year when you pay it all off. Now, you're not going to be asked in this class to come up with an amortization table like this. There are very easy ways to do this in Excel, kind of beyond the scope of this class. But understanding, especially because pretty much everyone in here is either bought a car or going to have to buy a car at some time in their life. Most people will finance a car in their lifetime. It's important for you to at least understand what's happening with your money and understand why at the beginning of the loan you're usually pretty upside down in the car because a lot of the payments you're making are just going towards interest and you're not really paying down the car. As time passes, more and more of the amount you're paying is going towards that principal and not interest, and so you are basically owning more and more of that asset. That's just personal practicality, I guess. Let's see. So, using that amortization schedule that we just looked at, what does the journal entry look like for each of these? Well, it's always going to have this format. You're going to have a debit to interest expense, a debit to notes payable, because the interest expense captures what you're paying in interest. The debit to notes payable captures how much you're reducing the principal. Okay? And then, of course, the actual monthly payment in cash stays the same each time. The only thing that changes is the percent of that payment that goes towards interest and the percent that's going towards the principal. Okay? Yeah, mortgage essentially is the same as what we just discussed there, where you have part principal, part interest, and as time passes, the percentage that's going towards interest reduces, and each payment you make is going more and more towards the principal. Anybody have any questions on these? From a journal entry perspective, this is all basically review, right? You handle liabilities the same way as you always have. Payable accounts, credit balance on those. The only real complications in this chapter, I think, are just kind of wrapping your brain around the premium and discount on the bonds, and just remembering that there may be times when you have a liability that's part current liability, part long-term, if there are some payments due within a year, some payments longer than a year. Anybody have any questions? All right, see y'all on Thursday. Thursday, we're just going to work practice problems with this stuff. I was thinking about covering another chapter, but I'm not in a hurry. So we're gonna do practice problems, and that's it.
At one point you were saying, like, I guess the incentives for getting a certain bond is at the end it turns into stock.
Mm-hmm.
Say you have a bond and at the end you're going to own like the equivalent of 5% of the company. Whatever. You're going to have that many shares. Can sometime through that they see, oh my God, like he's going to own more than we're really willing to give. Can we dilute that share before we have to cash in on that?
So that, again, that's going to all be part of the contract, right? You're not, I mean, if I was going out in the marketplace and buying bonds, because I don't really invest in that kind of stuff, right? I mean, I know theoretically how this stuff works, but I'm just saying, like, I'm not what you would call a super savvy investor. So you might be able to pull something like that on me where you have, if I don't have a lawyer look at it who specializes in this, where the terms of the bond are such that if the interest rate goes up or down, or the value of the company shoots out of the sky, and you say, hey, I don't want to give away any more of that. And so you kind of have a backdoor clause where you can do something to totally dilute the shares so that what you're actually giving them is worth less.
Yeah.
Is that what you were saying, what you're asking?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, you could try to throw provisions like that in there, but that's why people pay lawyers to look at this stuff. Because they want to make sure they're not getting bent over.
Is it done the same way with the U.S. Treasury bonds?
As far as
the way it works? Because I know the Treasury bonds, when they there's been times when it's like, oh, it's no taxes, and then right before they come through, they're like, no, there is taxes, so they can get their money back.
Theoretically, it's the same, other than the fact that your recourse is I'm going to sue the United States government and lose. Versus I'm suing a private company and I have a fair shot of winning.
So basically it functions.
It should function like this.
It should work the same
if the
way,
government
but
didn't
the
have a
government
get out of
just
jail
changed.
free card. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Can you open up the quiz?
Is it not open?
Oh, I haven't checked it.
Oh, okay.
I was just like ready for it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
it was a bad deal. My grandfather got Treasury bonds during World War II, and basically